Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority, brought to you today by Skyrim and the Key Worker Homes Fund. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. As regular viewers will know, our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And one of the ways that we do that is through this channel, the Voice of Authority. It's a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions, their challenges, influences, and issues of urgency. And as we plunge ever deeper into lockdown 3, we're more determined than ever to keep the conversation going and keep our network communicating. To that end, we're going to be back again tomorrow at 10 a.m. with a developer, you and I, to launch their research into brownfield registers and ask, are we on the cusp of a new era in data-led planning? And we've got a fantastic speaker lineup for that very timely topic, so make sure you register to watch at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. Membership is free both at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk and our LinkedIn members group. And members have already received our update on the compelling themes and topics we're bringing to you this quarter, and our invitation for you to get involved as speakers and as sponsors. So get in touch. We look forward to working with you on those. Now, Skyrim and the Key Worker Homes Fund did exactly that, and that's why we're here today with the second of our 3 knowledge exchange events. Now, these events are supporting the Key Worker Homes Fund invitation to councils and housing associations to bid for an initial fund of £100 million to enable the delivery of homes for key workers. The fund is one part of disruptor developer Skyrim's plan to deliver over 10,000 homes for London's key workers in mutually beneficial partnerships with London's local authorities and housing associations. And why? Because COVID-19 has brought long overdue recognition of the critical role that key workers play in supporting society and sustaining our cities. It's thanks to their efforts that we can live as free and educated and safe people. The movement in spring 2020 to clap for key workers demonstrated collective appreciation, but we all know that they deserve more than applause. And that was underlined by the limited success of last week's attempt to revive that weekly clap. The levels of exhaustion evident among key workers under relentless pandemic pressure for almost a year now mean that it's more urgent than ever to permanently improve key workers' quality of life. So how should that £100 million be invested to best effect? Well, joining us today to help answer that question, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a terrific panel in alphabetical order. Claire Benny, Director at Municipal, Sir Merrick Cockell, the Chairman of Localis, Arthur Kay, the Chair at the Key Workers Home Fund, and Councillor Martin Welton, Cabinet Member for Housing, Regeneration and Transport at Merton Council. We're not asking our panel to come up with the answers alone, viewers. Today's format is very much one for discussion and we want you involved. We'll be weaving in your questions as we move through 3 areas of discussion over the next hour, finishing with a look ahead to what significant changes will be visible across London in 5 or 10 years down the line from now. And before that, we'll be talking about the opportunities for and some of the challenges to airspace development as a way of providing key worker homes. And to that end, I'm going to share a little survey with you, popping onto your screens right now, a short survey for you to digest and respond to while we move on to the first area of discussion today. And that's going to be the idea of people living closer to where they work, the 15-minute city concept, and some of the implications and some of the consequences of that idea. So, Sir Merrick, turning to you first, has the pandemic made our city more localised, more tangibly a city of villages?
Well, thanks, Toby. I'm in the happy position, having spent about 30 years in London local government, of no longer for some years being in that world directly. So I'm no longer sort of accountable and responsible. But I now not only work with Localis, but also with developers and planners, and also with local government trying to raise capital that they can indeed invest into housing. So I see, perhaps the world's slightly different, but also as a lifetime Londoner really as well. I think in the first, you said we're lockdown 3. I'm not sure lockdown 2 was ever declared as lockdown, was it? But anyhow, lockdown 1, I think we all found out very quickly whether we did live in a 15-minute city, not just, and for most Londoners, certainly not living 15 minutes away from where they work, but actually, do you live 15 minutes away from your life needs, your day-to-day life needs, be that food shopping, potentially markets, hospitals, doctors' surgeries, all those elements. I live in West London, in Earl's Court, and I do live in 15 minutes of pretty well all those facilities. But for lots of other people, they found out they didn't, and I think that's a great challenge going forward. To be honest, I'm not sure the 15-minute city, it's a nice buzzy phrase. I'm not sure particularly, I think it always requires sort of more explanation of what it actually means. So I think we've got to find the right description for those day-to-day essential services being close at hand. And I think that there are lots of opportunities in that, because we all know, and this is going to be far more visible, isn't it? The retail and our high streets and the sort of village high streets of London, you might describe them as that, and the challenges that Martin and others have in securing those essential high streets. And we've all had ideas, and some have worked very effectively on, if it's not retail, what should be there. So I think the challenge to planners, to developers, to others, and to Londoners is making sure that those high streets actually have the facilities that we need. Not only were there to be another pandemic, but actually just, I think it's the quality of life that we need, pandemic or not. And I think it's sort of brought this to life for us. I guess we're going to talk about density and those sort of areas a little bit later on. I think what I would just say in my sort of opening remarks about key worker housing is, we've all been talking about key worker housing for lifetimes, and defining who key workers are and aren't, and well, I think that's that's become very clear now that the term key workers applies to far more people than we originally were defining it as, which was sort of hospital workers, teachers, etc., etc. Now people would say actually their key workers are a far wider group, and often not the most highly paid group either. So I think we've got to move beyond, and I know clearly people like Arthur and others are working on this, but simply within London as a whole, defining key workers is simply not good enough. On a sort of anecdotal level, I have daughters who are involved in education. The eldest one's a teacher. She has to travel a long distance to within London to be able to live and be able to teach. She's a key worker. She is eligible for some of the schemes currently existing, but there's no point in being a key worker and accessing some of those facilities if you live in Barking and Dagenham and you teach in Hounslow. That's those distances just don't work. So actually, how do you absolutely focus it down to say, okay, if you've got key workers in if you've got key workers in Hammersmith and Fulham, how can you help them to work in Hammersmith and Fulham, be they teachers or whatever? Or can you provide really good transport? So thinking of an example, Crossrail 2 I was involved in, that seems to be dead now, but there in the centre of Chelsea, you've got about 12,000 people working in health. Crossrail 2 was going to provide them very fast access to key worker housing that could, was sort of north or south on that line of Crossrail 2. That's another way of doing it. But somehow you've got to get people in the position where they truly can be a short time or a short distance away from where they live and where they work, and not have to travel across London. And we've seen that with the pandemic of the risk to themselves, because many of these key workers have had to work through and are continuing to work through the pandemic.
Thanks, Marek. That's a great way to kick us off. Martin, can I turn to you now? I mean, if you'd like to pick up on any of those themes, feel free. But we're talking around this idea of I guess, in the first instance, whether or not it's important to live close to where you work, and then secondly, in the specific instance of key workers, the relative importance of that idea, and how we might make it happen, and of course, what is a key worker. But the first theme that we picked up on was this idea of London becoming even more a series of villages, that sense of people becoming more focused on their local area. Is that something that you've noticed in the London Borough of Merton as well?
I think we do have a number of different communities here in Merton with very different demographics, very different makeup in terms of their population. Certainly parts of our borough do have a villagey feel, but others are obviously more urban. Again, there's huge challenges, economic challenges between the east and the west in Merton. But certainly I think lockdown and being working at home for the last year has brought up many challenges in terms of our local communities. And I think we are seeing long-term changes being accelerated. I know Merrick touched on Crossrail 2. We hope that would go to Wimbledon, but clearly going forward, you're going to have to look at in terms of, is it actually needed because of transport needs changing, more people working from home. That trend, I suspect, will accelerate over the next few years, given many have had to adapt in terms of their ways of working. In terms of key workers, it's affordability. I think what we find is that there's parts of our boroughs which are unaffordable to many key workers, especially the Wimbledon side of the borough, which is some of the most expensive housing in outer London. Mitcham side, much more affordable. So Merton is very much a borough of two halves. But what I think you probably certainly notice is that many people who do work, who are key workers in central London, in the health service, police, teaching, tend to live in the more affordable areas or away out in the Shire counties around London, like Surrey, Kent, and Essex, because living in London is incredibly expensive. And I think that's one of the things you do need to tackle, is the affordability issue. And we also have to think as well in terms of how people live their lives. It's a big challenge having to spend 1, 2, 3 hours a day commuting there and back from work. That does eat into a lot of leisure time, but also as well in terms of families. So there is a lot of benefits from livability, but it's also as well having the jobs to enable that to happen.
And do you find that that 15-minute city model is useful when you're thinking about development? I'm thinking particularly about sort of modern town centre, a big regen scheme you've got going now. Have you changed the way that you're thinking about that because of the pandemic, the way that patterns of movement have changed and people's lives have changed?
I think it hasn't changed us in terms of the concept of modern, but I think one of the things about modern, and one of the key components of the regeneration to build, 1,500 homes there, was actually people not just getting on a bus, but actually staying it, being a destination in itself. It's all very well building housing, but you do need to as well have the things to support that. The bars, the restaurants, entertainment as well, because that's supporting the local economy and that's creating jobs. I think in terms of modern, we're incredibly lucky is that we've got the National Trust Morden Hall Park right next. I think green spaces are absolutely essential. We're incredibly lucky in Merton that we do have many of them, but I think that does actually that has become certainly much more apparent in terms of the lockdown. And since last March, people are getting more exercise, and people are doing more walking and cycling, and having those green spaces, I think, has been vital, especially in terms of people's welfare.
No, fantastic. Thanks, Martin. Viewers, we know you're out there in huge numbers. Do let us know if you've got any questions you'd like to put to the panel on this theme of the 15-minute city, then get them in now, and we can include your questions in the conversation. But just to take it on to you, Claire, feel free to pick up on anything that's been said so far. But it seems that this idea of the way that the lives have changed isn't really affecting development plans that much, the design of new schemes. Do you think that the pandemic and the threat of more pandemics has altered the way we think, or the way we should think about residential density, about schemes in a city like London?
Yes, absolutely. Interestingly, everyone was trying to define 15-minute city earlier, and we're all grappling with whether it's in any use as a concept or not. They've used it a lot in Paris, but Paris, I've realised, is zones 1 and 2 in London. So London is so fundamentally different. I think 15 minutes has just got a different meaning. I've heard it defined as cutting out unnecessary journeys, which I think is quite a useful and very simple definition. But what we have to remember is 60% of people at least can't work from home, and those are the key workers. And I think this is kind of where we're arriving at, and they're the lower income people. And I wonder whether this whole kind of, oh, I live in a lovely village vibe is a little bit middle class and privileged, to be honest with you. And I'd really like to hear far more from nurses and supermarket workers about what they value, because they're not a conversation I'm having in any great depth at the moment. Just two more things, I think, from me. One is I love the city and I live in it because it isn't a village, and I find 15 minutes a bit scary, to be honest with you. I absolutely love my 60-minute life, and I say that as a woman too. You know, women were traditionally confined to a 15-minute world, and I do not want to go back there, and I'm sure there's a lot of other women that really don't either. So I get nervous that we've kind of domesticated our lives and that we're not going to sort of reach out back into the world anymore. So there's a sort of spiritual aspect to it, if you like. But as we've been talking this morning, I've also been thinking about maybe there's two kind of world overlays. I mean, there's inevitably far more than that, but there's a bunch of people, the 65%, that probably need to travel a fair bit, and they need to travel at rush hours, and they need a kind of a city which has got fast, efficient green transport, and they can get around. And those of us that can work at home or work in a non-rush hour way somehow sort of overlay our world on that, and we don't travel during rush hour and all that kind of thing. So I wonder if there's a sort of, we really do have to start thinking about the world. I mean, definitely not separating those people in any sort of spiritual or actual way, but to suddenly consider that some of us have far more flex in our lives than others. And I'll just say one more thing about density, because I know we'll come on to how we build things for people. London isn't that dense, as we know. It's 55 people or 21 homes a hectare. And if you stick all Londoners on a grid on London, we're 14 metres apart. So we're standing across the road from each other. So actually, there's a lot of space. And when you ask people that question in the abstract, they always say, oh, we're within a metre of each other. And it's like, no, we really aren't. But that doesn't mean there's loads of space to build in. 25% of London's area is back garden, and you can't build in there. So the lack of density is completely real, but the opportunity to intensify is really constrained, which is kind of where Skyrim comes in, really. Unless, of course, we want to demolish the suburbs, which, you know, I might put my hand up for, but that's a little bit controversial, and that's inevitably the quote that's going to appear on Twitter. Very, very finally, is there a direct correlation between density and the virus? I think there's a real danger that everyone will say, oh, density is bad, you know, it's disease, it's proliferation, etc. But virus transmission to me feels more about overcrowding, which is, it goes back to Martin's point about lack of affordability. So maybe it's more to do, and it's also with connectedness and the likelihood of travel. And I think somebody's got to look at the data really, really carefully before density kind of gets nixed in the whole post-pandemic discussion.
Well, I think that's right, Claire. And you've kind of played into a question from Adele Morris, a viewer. She's sort of suggesting that the densification, that regeneration is really about is really excluding people on low incomes. So when Martin was talking about providing the restaurants and the cafes and so on, those aren't facilities that those on low incomes can access because of the pricing. So that all of this becomes a discussion about the middle class for the middle class. And do you think there's a danger of that?
As a member of the middle class, I absolutely do think there's a danger of that. And that's why I just think the middle class need to think very hard and listen very hard to people who live very different, less flexible lives than their own.
Yeah, Martin, I'll give you the right to reply to that as well, in terms of what we were talking about, the specific scheme in Morden, but also more widely through Merton, before we come to you, Arthur.
I think that's an incredibly important point to actually raise, is that clearly that bars and restaurants will not be the destination of choice for many people on our low income. We have 10,000 people on our housing waiting lists. Some of them are from living in overcrowded accommodation. And I know myself that the number of people looking for housing transfers is huge here in Merton, and the lack of larger properties, 2-3 bedrooms, is a major concern, especially when you have families of 4 and 5 living in 1-bedroomed accommodation. So it's that livability and amenity space, which is important. I think it's important to have as well mixed communities, that we shouldn't just have it for one part of the population. It has to be across the population, accommodating all kinds of needs. But I think it's important to have mixed tenures in developments, and I think that is actually vitally important. So yes, I think that does have to be considered, and we do need to build more social homes for rent at levels that people can afford, because there is those different levels of needs out there.
Martin, let's just pick up on that and deal with it a little bit further. We've got Peter Wilson Morgan out there, and also Neil Webster making similar points, and that's around the designation of sites for key worker housing. Do you see key worker housing for, say, health and care workers on local public sites, perhaps NHS sites, as a key to your overall strategy for providing this affordable homes?
I think that's vitally important, and obviously we've done work in terms of one public estate, like many other London boroughs. Is that public sector land holdings a huge part in terms of London, and that's obviously linking up with local authorities and how those sites are brought forward. Key worker housing is a huge challenge. I used to be on the London Fire Authority when it was in existence, and I know with firefighters, most of them lived out in Surrey, Essex, Kent, because they could not afford to live in London due to the affordability issue. So I think it's important to address that, because that's going to be a major recruitment issue, and that does bring with in itself challenges in recruitment of staff if the accommodation is not affordable, but also as well in terms of their cost of living, coupled with transport, having the highest transport fares in the world in London. That's a major challenge. London is not a cheap city, but we do need to accommodate these needs. Otherwise, we will have a shortage of people. We won't be able to have people to do the tasks that this city needs, and especially in terms of recruitment of key workers. And that's already a challenge in this city in many sectors, and I suspect will come even more of a challenge in this post-Brexit world we're living in.
Thanks, Martin. Arthur, I hope you're storing up lots of responses to all of these different themes, and we'll come to you in just a second. But I just wanted to give Merrick a chance to come in there, because Merrick, you've got experience of a long experience of working in a borough that must almost rival parts of Wimbledon in terms of the affluence of its residents. What is the art of the possible here in terms of what can the council do to be sort of designating sites and specifying that this is for homes for key workers in the NHS, this is for homes for key workers in the fire services and so on? Is this something that is even advisable?
Well, let's face it. To date, that's in all our, everything behind this, in all our discussion, I think it's sort of, there's an assumption that everything's going to go back to as it was before. And none of us know, whether there are fundamental changes going on at the moment, kicked off by the pandemic, which may be accelerating, as in retail and things like that, what was already happening, or people's life choices, those that are frankly financially able to make those sort of life choices. Are they starting to do things that will have an impact on London and on the pressure on housing and things like that? So if we're speaking as sort of business, business as normal, then in most London boroughs, bar certain parts of certain ones, there is an enormous shortage of land. Therefore, yes, councils of whatever their politics would like to be able to allocate, chunks of land to key worker housing, but it's just not there. I think there is something, though, here about, and I think some of the questions I saw popping up were referring to this, is actually, we should collectively be doing far more now, if we can work out a fair definition of key workers, of working with those employers to actually say, because somebody referred to police housing, and I remember in Chelsea when the police sold off their section houses, I think they were called, is that the word? Anyhow, the housing for young policemen and women starting out in life who couldn't afford to have a family home somewhere, wanted to live close to where they work. That all went in the 70s, and to replace that now, you can't do it. That land's been sold off and gone to private ownership. But I think working with those employers, perhaps with a different landscape of thinking about where their workers, particularly the younger ones, nobody should be determining that if you work for a particular organization, you've got to live in a particular place. But still, those who are, starting out, particularly, of helping them to live close to where they work and bringing in, developers, because somewhere in this, there are business opportunities as well. There are lots of, whether it's housing associations or others, we know that there is demand there, and therefore there's, at the right price, at the right borrowing rates, and which we've got very low at the moment, there are opportunities here for to draw everyone in together to try and begin to find a solution. But the idea that there's, this is simple to do, if it was simple to do, it would have been done, a lifetime ago. So, but I think this is a time for, not rushing in, but reflection, seeing what, if there are behavior changes. Anecdotally, there are stories of, people taking their children out of school and moving out of London, or moving out to the suburbs, or whatever it may be. We see that with some property demands and things like that. If that is happening, what is happening then to inner London, and indeed, which I guess we talk about later. But I think London's collectively been complacent about its growth and its position, and just believed that that there is an endless demand. And I think London and other cities are going to have to sell themselves in future about why people would choose to want to live in a city as opposed to elsewhere.
Excellent. That might be that might feed well into the third part of our conversation today. But Arthur, in a second, we're going to get on to the question of airspace development and what it has to offer in this situation, and in particular issues of affordability. But before we do that, there's an opportunity for sort of more general reflections on that idea of the 15-minute city, of people living close to where they work, and of providing houses specifically for key workers.
Toby, thank you. So at Skyrim, and the reason we launched the Key Worker Homes Fund and are thrilled to be talking to you today, is all around how we can make the 15-minute city a viable option for key workers. I think, as Claire, Martin and Merrick have all touched on, at the moment for key workers, it's an unaffordable thing to live in London for many of them. Just to give some data behind what we've been talking about, at the moment, 70% of London's nurses who work in London's hospitals don't actually live in the same area in which they work. 57% of London's nursing staff, according to a recent report called Living in the Red, 57% are actually choosing not only to leave London, but leave the profession because it's so challenging at the moment. And that's a 16% increase from 2016. And if we look at just taking an average salary of a London police constable, on a post-tax basis, if they take an average London rent, they're spending 80% of their income on housing. So in terms of the, I guess, putting some data behind some of what we've been talking about, it's a very, very real problem. A number of the people who we work with as part of the Key Worker Homes Fund, and in fact, our first ambassador is a midwife in Hackney, and she spends roughly an hour and a half a day commuting either way between her place of work and her home. And so what we're broadly trying to do is find viable ways, economic ways, to try and reduce that hour and a half to 15 minutes. And the thing that we find exciting about the 15-minute city is that, you know, as Claire's touched on, it's not just about being a 15-minute stroll from your place of work, which may be unachievable in many cases, but it could be finding, you know, really fast, green and affordable public transport. You know, the average key worker at the moment spends £40 a week on public transport, with about 29% spending £80 a week on public transport. And you know, that may, you know, not sound like vast amounts in the scheme of things, but actually on a nurse's salary, that is a significant amount. And so what we're excited about and why we set up the Key Worker Homes Fund, as I say, is making the 15-minute city achievable for those key workers. And it's both anecdotally and when you look at the overarching data set, it's a very real problem, and one which to counter Merrick, your points, I think that it is something that there are viable solutions to, and yeah, looking forward to debating a few of them as we go forward.
Right, let's discuss one of those right now then, Arthur. So Airspace Development, the subject closest to your heart. We asked the audience earlier what they thought the opportunity might be for Airspace Development in London. I'm going to do the big reveal, such as it is, and share the results of that poll. It turns out that there's widespread sort of disagreement about the opportunity, but 40% of the audience think that between 200,000 and 400,000 units might be built in airspace above municipal buildings, assuming an average of 100 square meters per home and up to 6 additional stories on existing buildings. So let's let our panelists digest that for a moment. And Arthur, you can perhaps reveal how close to reality that number is.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a difficult one to be very specific on, because you know the caveat here is assumptions above municipal buildings, for example, and there have been a number of different reports over the last decade on this. This one actually comes from a WSP and UCL report from 2014, and the results are, drum roll please, 630,000 homes could be delivered in the airspace above existing buildings, and that's above municipal buildings in the Greater London area. There are different reports. In Knight Frank did a report a few years ago looking at just Zone 1. And in Zone 1, their estimate, if you're going to add 1 or 2 stories to suitable buildings, it was around 41,000. So, you know, Zone 1, 1 or 2 stories versus Greater London, up to 6 stories, obviously a very different large range there. But we're certainly talking hundreds of thousands of new homes as the potential size, the price here. The challenge is, as I think we've all touched on, is how the opportunity in terms of size of the prize, the demand in terms of need for key worker housing near to where they work, and then the actual technical and the very challenging elements of how that can be unlocked. The hard thing is how we can bring those three elements together.
Great stuff, Arthur. And just for clarity, do you want to repeat that number?
630,000 new homes. And as I say, that's a WSP report and UCL report from 2014, in case anyone wants to check it out.
So 18% of our audience were on the money. Claire, was that anything like what you thought? And B, what's your response to that finding?
I've often been called a little bit glass half empty in my life, which is not a thing I'm proud of. But so you won't be surprised to hear that I put it more like 150,000. But I'm thinking about, I don't know if municipal buildings count as, you know, non-housing as well. But this is my, I'll just do a tiny speed through how I did it. About a third of London's homes are in purpose-built blocks, just a bit more. A third of those are post-war, so they've probably got a flat roof. So you've got 400,000 homes there. If you've got 30 homes a block and you add 30% more, I think that's around the 150,000 new homes mark. But interestingly, 150,000 homes is not insignificant. I sort of thought, right, that's adding 4% to the stock, which might sound really feeble, but what's really interesting about 4% is that it reminded me of another stat, which is that the new towns added 4% to the UK stock. So we're effectively building a new town in London on its roofs if we achieve the 150,000. My only other point is in pondering stock distribution, and I'm really interested in what people think about this in the audience and on the panel. I'm going to make a massive generalization now. Key workers are probably, on the whole, a little bit younger, a little bit fitter, a little bit more adaptable. And it always occurs to me that people who need really modern, really warm, brand new, adaptable homes are older people. And I'm just wondering, you know, the choices for older people in London are absolutely terrible. I'm sure we've all been through looking for suitable homes for parents who are getting on a bit. And when you look with them around, it's just terrible. And I always want to build, if I was, you know, queen for the day, every single new home would be for those people to downsize into, and then you'd free up all the slightly dodgier older stock for those people that are kind of still kind of, you know, able to deal with a bit of imperfection and really possibly, you know, don't need the brand new home. So I wonder whether there's a kind of building program which is amazing views and warmth for older people, and then they leave their home, the key workers move in there. Just a thought.
Fantastic, thanks, Claire. We'll come back to that, I think, and Arthur, I'll ask you about the opportunities for different generations in Airspace homes. But Martin, first off, number one, that whether it's 150,000 or 600, over 600,000 new homes, there's a lot of new homes that are likely to be built in Airspace, it seems. How many of those are likely to be built in Merton, do you think? I mean, where do the sort of suburbs versus central London sit in the discussion about airspace development? And also, you mentioned something about green space earlier and how important it is to people's well-being. I mean, does rooftop green space count? Is it helpful for people's well-being to have rooftop gardens, or is it just a sort of an accessory that doesn't really provide the medicine that people need?
I think in terms of actually delivering those numbers, it brings with itself its own challenges. It's the actual lack of land availability, even if you're looking at putting additional stories on top of buildings. High-rise buildings aren't always popular. In order to reach our housing targets have been increased to 900 by the Mayor of London, the London Plan. Merton in 1 year, the most we've delivered is around the 500-600 mark, and it's probably around the 300-400, and some of that is due to land. So it's all very well building higher, and I think we do need to build higher in many instances in London. But I think we also have to think about land availability as well. And when we talk about municipal buildings, many of those municipal buildings would probably be better off being demolished. And actually, councils have fewer and fewer municipal buildings. There's other parts of the public sector which probably does have more land available. I take Merton Council, for example. You know, we sit on a 14-storey building in the middle of Morden. You could, maybe put extra stories on that, though. Brings itself challenges in itself because it's the only high-rise building around there. But that is a challenge. I think many of us have seen that in terms of planning applications in our individual boroughs. In terms of rooftop gardens, I think they're a very nice concept, but ultimately, people want to go out walking and cycling and keeping active. And how much does that contribute to that? I suspect relatively little. They're nice to have that outdoor space, especially when you have better weather, like not in the middle of winter. But ultimately, people do need to have those green spaces. And I think probably the other point I'd like to add as well, in terms of key workers, if you're a 20-something person, you probably care less for having the amenity space compared to, say, a 30 or 40-something with families who do want to have gardens. I mean, I think there's different choices to make. As you settle down, you go through life. I think we talked about generational issues there as well in terms of older people, but also as well people with families. living in high-rise buildings is not a lifestyle choice for some people. Some people like it, but others do want to have that space, and they value the outdoor space as well, but also as well in terms of their parks and green spaces. So I think the big challenge you have in London is obviously you can have some development, but it's the level of development which is needed and how high you go. There is clusters in London where that's successfully done. Other parts of London, that's much more of a challenge.
Okay, Martin. So Merrick, turning to you. So it seems that we've got a conversation around some parts of London are going to experience this airspace development quite intensely, and other parts aren't, perhaps. What has Localis got to say to that, and perhaps to residents of your former borough when they're faced with the possibility of rooftop extensions? And there are some other sort of themes that are developing in this. If you feel that you'd like to pick up on there around green space and the availability of that, around affordability in particular, we're going to come on to sustainability and that intergenerational aspect as well.
Yeah, I'm assuming that the term municipal buildings actually means sites in public ownership, does it? Because municipal buildings sort of sounds like the town hall, doesn't it? I'm assuming it's wider than that, and that's how you get to that sort of 600,000, large numbers on this. I mean, I hope, because I used to chair London Council, so I can see beyond the world of Kensington and Chelsea, which isn't always the best example. Beyond London as well. But I think the difficulty in all this is when you move from the sort of theoretical, the desktop work to okay, so how do you do it? And when I was in Kensington and Chelsea, we actively, and they continue to do so, and are building some now, but looked to blocks, housing blocks, and others where they could add, they could do infill if there was unnecessary wasted open space, or garage blocks, or indeed on roofs and things like that. And it is, okay, maybe because the inner London boroughs are, the pressure is greater, but I think this applies. It's not easy stuff to do, because the will. It's not that the will isn't there from local authorities. It's been there for a very long time, because they're all grappling with trying to provide more housing. But if you look at an estate, for instance, and you start talking about changes to it, there is a lot of opposition. People who live there have lived there happily, hopefully, for a long time, don't want it either knocked down, and there are endless examples one can quote, or indeed don't want the disruption that comes from builders coming in and changing things that they've been used to and comfortable with. And there is a lot of resistance, and maybe as one gets older, one's resistance and one's willingness and ability to cope with that change becomes more and more difficult. So I suppose something has to give on this. And okay, the current government has plans for planning reforms, and a lot, at the core of that is a change in the right of individuals, or the time at which individuals can have an input into the planning process. And that may be the compromise that has to be made if you are going to take a lot of extra airspace, is that that has to become a greater priority than the rights of individuals to oppose whether they live on the estate or their local residence or whatever it may be, because Londoners as a whole consider it a greater priority to achieve this housing than the ability to turn down every application. So that's I don't know if you want to pick up that. Otherwise,
yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, Merrick, because I wonder if part of the conversation earlier was this sort of discovery of all these key workers. We didn't realise how dependent on various people we were until the pandemic hit, and maybe that's a sort of rediscovery of society and how it works. We're all interdependent. We live close to each other. We all do things that affect each other and support each other, even if we don't recognise that. And maybe that's something that's coming out that might feed into that consultation process and feed into people's understanding of development. But one of the things I just wanted to bring to you, Arthur, from what's been said so far is around that idea of disruption and around the difficulty of development and the difficulty of building new homes. One of the things that you're bringing to the table is modern methods of construction, offsite construction. So how far do you think that's going to go to resolving some of those issues and getting people over the hurdle of we don't want more homes here, we don't want the disruption?
A great question. And from every development that we do at Skyrim as part of the Key Worker Homes Fund, the community engagement element is something we begin right at the very beginning and is central to it, because if you can't get I don't think there does need to be necessarily a compromise in terms of self-determination of estates or individuals. It's more around trying to find ways to get the people who live there, existing residents and local communities, on side early. And different projects will have different approaches. Some estates will need full regeneration, which involves knocking down, which is not what we do. Some estates are fine as they are and won't need further work or won't be suitable for further work. And so we're really interested in the vast majority of potential sites where there are opportunities for that incremental density, that infill, and that kind of airspace development as well. And the way we see it broadly is two things. One is to minimize the negatives. And I don't want to pretend there aren't negatives here. There is some disruption, and there is obviously increased density on the site and new floors above. And so the ways that we minimize disruption, I'll come on to shortly. And the second is to try and find ways to use this mode of development to unlock value and be able to reinvest in the existing building and infrastructure and provide tangible, demonstrable benefits for existing residents and local communities. So the piece that I think the audience might find most interesting is around how you can actually minimize the negatives and disruption to existing residents. And so the way that we do that is broadly two different approaches. The first is by using modern methods of construction. So we build the homes off-site in UK-based factories, and that, as a rule of thumb, means that you, instead of having builders and scaffolding on-site, which might take certainly months, if not years, these are built off-site in a factory and craned into position very rapidly. So it brings down time on site construction and disruption to existing residents massively. The second piece is that we have developed a proprietary podium system, which basically means that using this technology, we can circumvent a lot of the technical challenges that come with airspace development. So for example, an existing building's structure, an existing building service, and also some of the access requirements of existing buildings, because I think a lot of people are that's a question I get asked a lot when people hear about this concept, certainly. In terms of then benefits, I think, I'm sure, Martin, you're kind of very close to this at the moment, and Merrick probably as well, in terms of things like, the cladding scandal has come through, and there's a lot of costs that local authorities and housing associations will be facing in the coming years. Also upgrading communal areas, taking on cyclical maintenance works. So the capital that can be unlocked through this, and as I say, the £100 million of the Key Worker Homes Fund can be used to invest in the existing building as well, to bring that up to scratch, which often needs to be done anyway. So there's, I guess, really two buckets. One is minimizing the negatives and trying to find these tangible benefits to be able to invest in the existing building also. And
specifically around the idea of affordability, there are a lot of questions coming in on the chat and the Q&A around affordability, and it's so relevant to key worker homes. How are you improving the offer, as it were, through your system?
So we launched Skyrim in 2018, and we wrote this white paper, which you can get online if anyone's interested. And the big idea behind that, for the housing experts on the call, you won't find this an insight at all, but when we were writing it with UCL, it was the thing that we focused around, which is essentially around that we often hear the headline that London has a housing crisis, or the UK has a housing crisis. That is one of the outcomes of what we think the real problem is, which is a cost of land crisis. And so, for example, we don't have housing crises in rural areas or certain parts of the UK or cities that are less desirable, but we do have incredibly expensive housing in essentially the parts of cities where people currently want to live. And so the reason that I quoted those figures too early around the cost of a police constable's salary in London being 80% of his post-tax income so high is because London at the moment is an incredibly desirable and thus expensive place to live. And so our main insight is not how do you reduce the cost of housing, but how do you reduce the cost of land as part of the equation for housing? And that was actually the insight that led us to Airspace Development, because our model and what we're doing with the Key Worker Homes Fund is actually through using airspace rather than land, you can bring down that land cost significantly and therefore have more capital to not only deliver an affordable home to the end user, but also to invest more in your construction costs to make that home of a much higher standard. And so we may come on in shortly to talk about environmental credentials of the homes, for example, but you can find ways to, for example, increase ceiling heights, increase and improve quality of materials, spend more in terms of the design quality by working with fantastic architects and engineers, etc. So it's looking at the what in a kind of product term would be called the unit economics of a project, and trying to bring down that land value as much as possible. And that is where you can unlock that affordability. Thanks,
Arthur. And just before we broaden the conversation, then let's bring in that idea of sustainability. I hope, Val Bagnall, we've answered your question, but the big question that was put by James Sohn and that's had the most votes amongst the audience is around the climate emergency. So can you talk a little bit, just a minute or so, about how sustainable an approach airspace development is, and your model in particular, and also to James's question, is it radical enough given the nature of the scale of the climate emergency?
Is it radical enough? I would say no. I think we need a plethora of solutions, and this is one small strand in terms of an enormous challenge, and one that's not, the built environment is obviously a big contributor to CO2 emissions and biodiversity loss, but there are other sectors as well which need to pull together. So this is one small thread within one industry. So definitely not radical enough, James. In terms of specifically the model that we work to, broadly we categorize the way in which this can benefit in terms of sustainability in 3 different ways. The first is the actual usage of the home. The person who lives in the home at the end, once it's delivered, what's their carbon footprint? And bizarrely, we have this idea. There's a book I'd recommend to anyone called The Triumph of the City by a Harvard economist called Edward Glacier. And there's this counterintuitive idea that living in nature is the greenest place to be, and that proximity to nature makes us more environmentally friendly. And this is this feels right, but it's actually incorrect. If you look at the UK, the average CO2 footprint per person in a suburban or rural area is around 11 to 12 tons of CO2 per person. And if you then move that person exactly the same lifestyle and move them to a dense urban area, let's take the inner London boroughs, for example, their CO2 emissions drop to around 5 tons of CO2 per person on average. And so the first piece we look at in terms of sustainability is what's the person, the human being who lives in these homes, what is their lifestyle going to be like because of that? And so building in dense areas and increasing density means that the person will roughly halve their CO2 emissions simply by living there.
Great. So we're going to be back on February the 10th, I think, talking more about how we create neighbourhoods that are sustainable going forward. So we'll just reserve that part of the conversation for then, I think, Arthur. If you could just repeat the name of that book for our viewers.
That's The Triumph of the City by Edward Glacier.
Thanks very much. So Claire, take from you what you will from those threads so far, but the one that I'd particularly like you to talk to, because you're my touchstone on consultation and engagement, if you like, is this doing enough to get us to a place where we're going to be able to build the houses that we need, that we'll have permission to build the houses that we need from our fellow citizens?
Indeed, it's always a really difficult one, and as has already been mentioned, just change in general is difficult to sell. What I find interesting, though, when the GLA do their sort of housing stats thing every year, they actually have a metric on how amenable people feel to new development, and actually that stat is getting better. So NIMBYism is decreasing in London, which really surprised me when I read it, but it's true. I suspect that in outer London, that's the real sort of pinch point at the minute, because as Martin has mentioned, a lot more higher density is being proposed in outer London, and that's really difficult. Right, but I want to go to one specific thing, and I'm going to sound slightly like a broken record now, but at Peabody, I did loads of development, infill, on estates, and it was never popular with the people who already lived there. However, my number one way of getting people kind of slightly more on board was to say they could move in. So if you've got a load of people on an estate, some of them have lived there 30, 40 years, they've had their kids, their grandchildren, etc. If you say to them, it isn't us and them, we're not going to have a bunch of kind of those people up on the roof, you can move in, to be honest. And then what we'll do is move those people into the voids that you leave behind. And therefore, you've suddenly got a completely integrated community where everyone's getting to know each other. You haven't got the funny new build with the people that nobody knows in it. And as it gets built, people suddenly started ringing up people going, can I have one of those? And I just sort of thought, fantastic. So I think there is that. What was the other way? I mean, you obviously have to invest in the rest of the building. And I think Arthur's model never thinks, oh, we'll just slip these on and off we'll go. There has to be a benefit to the building it's going on to. But actually, depending on the financial model, sometimes that asset management can be part cross-subsidised by the rooftop development. So there are some wins there, but there is no question that for the people on the top floor, it's going to be a quite difficult experience, which MMC definitely will help with if you can crane them in. But it needs such kind of careful conversations and really honest conversations about the benefits and drawbacks.
Yeah, honest conversations, absolutely. Arthur, just before we do our sort of the final section of the discussion today, can I just come to you with a point from Charles Gillott in the audience, which is to Claire's point really about how you can't be considering that the same amount of building can take place on every building of a particular type. There must be more detailed consideration of structural factors and local factors. I mean, is there any evidence from research of that kind, or is there a plan to extend your research to provide more detail?
Yeah, so it's not specifically research, it's now in the doing stage. So the fund provides the, I say £100 million in financing and pro bono consultancy support to any local authority or housing association who has a building, an estate, even a portfolio that they would like to have on a pro bono basis assessed and have the opportunity to be funded as well. And so in that study, essentially bringing it up to equivalent of pre-app stage or RIBA stage 1. And through that process, we look at all of the elements in terms of structural integrity, viability, feasibility, look at a number of the rights to light and technical elements, massing, etc. And you're exactly right. There's definitely not a one size fits all kind of slap one story on here or two stories on there. It's looking at what the building needs, what investment can be unlocked through it. And some buildings may be able to take significant massing and some may be able to take nothing at all. And so it's really trying to look at that. We can take principles, and we have our rooftop development principles and community and sustainability charters, but we really look to apply those on a bespoke basis to each opportunity that comes up. And as I say, the expressions of interest, if you represent a local authority or a housing association, the expressions of interest form is now open. So if you've got a building in mind, you can drop it into the online form, and then a member of the Skyrim team will be in touch to work through that with you.
That's great, and the colleagues are putting the links in the chat now, viewers. So if you want to contact the Key Worker Homes Fund through those links, please do so now. It sounds, Arthur, it sounds like yet another case for the importance of data in planning and development at the moment, and there's a need to build those data sets in these new areas. But our hour is almost up, and I want to go round briefly each of our panelists today and just ask a question, starting with you, Merrick. If you have your way, if we were to jump into a time machine right now and spin ourselves forward a decade, when we emerge from that TARDIS, what would we see significantly and obviously different in London?
Well, I'm taking the words you've used. So you're, see. I'm taking seeing as being important. So not the sort of
extend it to all the senses.
Okay, right. Well, anyhow, I taking what I was touching on earlier, I think if the period of coming out of this pandemic, looking forward, as I said, I don't think London can dare to rest on its laurels I think potentially London in particular is at real risk, because many of the negatives, the problems that we've all been living through in the last year are clearer in London, the density and everything like that, and indeed the impact of the pandemic. I think we've got, London has to become, we always have talked about sort of beautiful spaces and making beautiful buildings, beautiful spaces between buildings and everything like that. But we have actually got to deliver on it. London has got to become a far more enjoyable place to live, and for people to choose to live their lives here, particularly as those that can choose, they will they're looking at other alternatives in their lives. So, and what actually matters to them and their values and things like that. And I think we have to see, some of the temporary changes that have been made, the road closures and the lanes are cheap and ugly, and they haven't made London a more pleasant place to move around for Londoners, when we've been able to move around, and for those that have to move around. And I think we have to make sure that that the quality of the very forefront, as well as key worker housing and all these elements, is we have to make London a place that people choose to want to live in, and that there are good reasons for that. That it's a civilized place with civilized spaces, and we carry on with all those priorities of trying to make sure it's affordable and everything like that. There may be consequences from the last year that we just can't see, that one can't plan these things, they happen, the after effects happen as well, that we've got to take collectively those opportunities that are there to achieve that.
Thanks, Merrick. And audience, feel free to share your vision of London 10 years from now as well. We welcome that through the chat. Martin, we're in the TARDIS. We're about to open the door. What are you going to hope to see or sense or feel or smell in London that's different in 10 years from now, if you've had your way?
I think in the first instance, obviously be recovering from this pandemic. That's going to be a huge challenge. I think for the next 2 or 3 years, it's going to have long-term implications. But I think when we talk about, obviously, building, we talk about sustainable communities as well, and having that supporting infrastructure and amenities, especially in terms of leisure, entertainment, green spaces, and accessibility as well, because I think that's something that people do actually look for as well. I think probably in terms of the other points, I think London will certainly see a lot more taller buildings. That's certainly going to happen in the next 10 years because we will have to increase that density level if we are to continue to be a growing city. There's been some trends in the last year where the population of London has dropped for the first time in 30 years. Hopefully that won't be a long-term trend, but we do want to recognise the changes that are have happened, but there will be further changes, and the way we work is going to hugely change in the years to come. And I think we have to, as a city, adapt to that and accept that happening, but also as well having that sense of community, because that's very important to many people living in this great city.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. And Claire, finally, we're whizzing towards the future, 10 years from now, stepping out of the TARDIS. You've had your way. You've become Queen of London for a day or a year, as you requested earlier. What do you see or sense that's different in the city in a decade from now, if you've had your way?
Okay, I've got 5 things, but I just first of all want to say dense doesn't mean tall, and I would love to see less height and more density. Dolphin Square is 10 stories max, and it's 450 dwellings a hectare. That's my last stat for today. Right, 5 things. Shared workspace, let's have those reviving the high streets and on estates even. I think we all don't want to sit in our homes. We want to sit somewhere else if we can. And I'm talking about the people who can work from home now. So lots of shared workspace on high streets and estates. Shared gardens being a lot more valued and used by all. And I include streets in that. I think we should close more streets and have less cars on them. And I know that's controversial for outer London people, but I've said it. I want to see old people in really beautiful, warm 2-bed flats that they love. And I want to see incredibly fast and pleasant public transport for the 60%. I can imagine things just travelling at high speed and therefore the distance becomes less important. And finally, I'd really like to see the City of London, and I mean the square mile, being a proper neighbourhood. And I can imagine a lot of those offices are, going to be redundant, and let's have artists in the Gherkin.
Artists in the Gherkin, fantastic. I want to be in one of those cosy 2-bedroom homes, Claire. So let's hope that vision comes true. Arthur, it's in your hands. You've got the £100 million fund. You've got the Airspace Development system. So we step into the TARDIS and we whiz 10 years down the line. If you've had your way, what do we see when we step out in the middle of London?
So this is a more myopic answer, but from our perspective, we want today for local authorities and housing associations to get involved and to apply for part of the £100 million in funding. And our ambition over exactly 10 years is to deliver 10,000 new homes to key workers near to where they work. And so our ambition is so that people like our Hackney midwife, Alicia, who we mentioned earlier, can live the 15-minute city that a lot of us aspire to. So that's our dream, and hope that many of you will mirror that and join us.
Excellent. Well, that call to action is going to be the last word today, so it's very, very fitting. Viewers, use those links in the chat to join the Key Worker Homes Fund and make the most of that £100 million. And before you dive off to your next meeting or take a break for a well-being walk around your local green space or failing that, your local block, please join me in thanking our terrific panel for sparing their valuable time to share their knowledge and experience and insights with us today. What a treat. It was a lovely conversation. Thank you. Thank you especially Claire Benny of Municipal, and thank you especially Sir Merrick Cockell from Localis, and thank you especially to Councillor Martin Welton of Merton Council, and thank you of course to Arthur Kay from the Key Worker Homes Fund and Skyroom, both for contribution to the conversation and also for your partnership in presenting this knowledge exchange series. And most of all, of course, viewers, thank you as ever for you to tune in and for gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with your stimulating questions. We've got dozens of them still coming in. Many of them are left hanging, but if you join our LinkedIn members club, you'll find responses from our panel, if they'd be so kind to indulge us by reading through some of them and responding by email to us, and we'll circulate those responses through LinkedIn over the coming days. You'll also get a lead on the compelling topics and themes coming up on TVOA over the next quarter, including the third and final in this series of knowledge exchange webinars. We're going to be back tomorrow at 10 a.m. on the new era of data-led planning with the developer, you and I, unveiling its new research. So register for that at the voiceofauthority.co.uk. Meanwhile, make sure you get in your bids to the Key Worker Homes Fund using the links in the chat. And until tomorrow, from our fabulous panel, from Skyroom and the Key Worker Homes Fund, from me and from everyone at 3Fox, good afternoon.